There are entire states in America where you could drive for hours and not pass a single town, a single stoplight, or a single soul. Not ghost towns, not disaster zones, just vast, empty land that millions of people have quietly decided to leave behind and never come back to. We're going to break down exactly why nobody lives in these empty states, what's actually driving the population collapse, and what it reveals about where America is really heading. And look, if you think this is just about wide open spaces and cold weather, stay with me, because the real reasons will genuinely surprise you. My name is Ethan Vale. A few years ago, honestly, I was convinced that where you lived didn't really matter. I thought opportunity was everywhere, and population trends were just kind of background noise, the kind of stuff economists argue about, not something that actually affects your life. I was completely wrong. I started digging into the data behind why certain states were emptying out, and what I found changed the way I look at real estate, the economy, and where wealth is actually moving in this country. Now I track these shifts, so you don't have to start from scratch the way I did. And I want to be upfront about something. This isn't doom and gloom, and it's not political. It's just the data. And the data tells a very clear story. Here's what most people get completely wrong about this. They assume the empty states are empty because nobody wants to live there. But that's actually backwards. The real question isn't about desire, it's about economics. And when you follow the money and the lack of it, the picture becomes a lot more interesting. We're going to break this down into 9 states, counting down from least empty to most empty. And along the way, you're going to see a pattern that has nothing to do with weather or scenery. It has everything to do with jobs, real estate, infrastructure, and the way population shapes economic destiny. Let's get into it. Number 9, Maine. Here's a stat that should stop you cold. Maine is the oldest state in America by median age. Not oldest in terms of history, though it has plenty of that. Oldest in terms of the people actually living there right now. The median age in Maine sits at 44.8 years. To put that in context, that's nearly 5 years older than the national median. And that number right there tells you almost everything you need to know about what's happening economically. Maine has 1.38 million residents spread across 35,380 square miles. That's a lot of land for a relatively small population, especially compared to its neighbors on the East Coast. But here's the thing most people miss. Maine isn't just rural, it's selectively populated. Nearly every resident lives in the southern third of the state or along the coast. The rest, 89% untouched forest, and that's not an accident. The economics of rural Maine have been in slow decline for decades. The seafood industry, lobster fishing specifically, pulls in over 4 million pounds a year and drives significant coastal revenue. Tourism fills in the seasonal gaps, but the year-round job market outside Portland is limited. The median household income sits around $60,000, which sounds reasonable until you factor in Maine's cost of living, and a median home price of approximately $320,000, particularly punishing in coastal areas where all the economic activity is concentrated. You might be wondering, if home prices are that high, why aren't more people moving in? Well, this is actually the real estate paradox of the empty states. High housing costs without the corresponding wage base to support them. That combination doesn't attract young workers, it pushes them out. Only 38.7% of Maine residents live in urban centers, the lowest urban concentration of any state in America. Portland is genuinely thriving. Great restaurants, a recovering tech sector, a real economy. But Portland can't carry the entire state, and the rest of Maine, with its aging population and limited opportunity for younger workers, is in a slow population bleed. People leave in their 20s. They think about coming back to retire. Some do, many don't. The infrastructure picture compounds this. When you have low population density spread across a large geographic area, the cost of maintaining roads, utilities, and emergency services per capita becomes enormous. Maine's winters are not just inconvenient, they're expensive. 70+ inches of snow annually, heating bills that rival rent in other states, and road conditions that make logistics challenging for businesses looking to operate outside the southern corridor. Maine isn't failing, but it's running a slow demographic deficit that's very hard to reverse. And that matters economically, because an aging population increases healthcare costs and draws down the workforce just as states need revenue to maintain aging infrastructure. Number 8, Montana. Let me give you a number that puts Montana's situation in immediate perspective. Montana is larger than Japan, significantly larger in fact, at 147,000 square miles. Japan has 125 million people. Montana has 1.12 million. That's less than 1/100th of Japan's population in a bigger geographic space. Now, why does that matter economically? Because population density is one of the core drivers of economic productivity. Dense populations create markets. They support businesses, justify infrastructure investment, and generate the tax base that funds schools, roads, and public services. Montana's density, just 7.5 people per square mile, makes sustained economic development extraordinarily difficult outside of a handful of corridors. The economic landscape in Montana leans heavily on agriculture, tourism, and mining. These are industries with real value, but they don't generate the kind of diversified, high-wage employment that retains younger workers. The largest city, Billings, barely clears 100,000 residents. Some towns are so remote that the nearest commercial retail is 2 to 3 hours away. Here's where it gets interesting from a real estate angle. Montana's median home price sits around $360,000, and it's been climbing. Why? Because of an influx of remote workers and wealthy out-of-state buyers, primarily from California and the Pacific Northwest, who discovered Montana's open land and relatively lower costs during the pandemic era. But that influx has been a double-edged sword. It's driven up prices for residents whose wages haven't kept pace, with the average household income in Montana running approximately $60,000. This is a pattern, by the way, that you'll see repeated across several of the states we're covering today. External demand inflating real estate values in places where the local economy can't organically support those prices. The result is a hollowing out of the middle class. People who grew up in these states can no longer afford to stay. And when local residents leave because of housing costs, they're often replaced by seasonal or part-time residents who spend relatively little in the local economy year-round. Montana also faces serious infrastructure challenges. Cell service is spotty across vast portions of the state. High-speed internet access is limited outside urban centers. And one thing most people don't account for, Montana has one of the highest grizzly bear populations in the lower 48, with approximately 1,800 bears ranging across its forests and mountains. That's not just a tourism fact, it's an operational reality that shapes where and how people can actually live and work productively. Number 7, Wyoming. Wyoming is where you start to see what genuine economic isolation really looks like. 580,000 people, 97,000 square miles, 6 people per square mile. The largest city in Wyoming is Cheyenne, with a population of approximately 65,000 for a state capital that is strikingly small, and it speaks to something fundamental about Wyoming's economic structure. There's no major urban anchor driving growth, innovation, or employment diversification. Wyoming's economy is built almost entirely on natural resources. Coal, oil, and natural gas drive state revenue. But here's the vulnerability that most economic analyses of Wyoming don't adequately address. Resource economies are structurally unstable. When commodity prices fall, they always cycle. Wyoming's budget suffers, job opportunities contract, and people leave. The median household income runs around $64,000, which sounds acceptable until you understand how geographically isolated that income has to stretch. The infrastructure reality of Wyoming is stark. Public transportation is essentially non-existent. You need a vehicle to get from one town to the next, and in winter that becomes a genuine survival calculation. Wyoming averages approximately 50 inches of snowfall annually. Temperatures regularly drop below zero. The state sees severe winter storms that can shut down travel for days at a time. What makes Wyoming's situation particularly instructive from an economics of migration standpoint is what isn't here. There are no major research universities driving innovation, no major medical centers creating healthcare employment, no tech sector to speak of. Yellowstone and the Grand Teton Mountains draw millions of tourists every year, and that's genuinely significant. But tourism employment is predominantly seasonal and low wage. It doesn't build the kind of sustained economic ecosystem that retains a growing workforce. You might be thinking, but Wyoming has no state income tax, which is a major draw for high net worth individuals. And that's accurate. Wyoming does attract wealthy residents specifically for its tax structure, but that migration dynamic, wealthy individuals moving in for tax efficiency, is not the same as broad-based population growth. It doesn't fill schools, support local businesses across income levels, or build the workforce a modern state economy actually needs. The net result is a state that is, by almost every measure, fiscally dependent on resource extraction, structurally resistant to diversification, and increasingly unable to retain the younger workers who would otherwise grow its economic base. Number 6, Vermont. Vermont is a fascinating case because it genuinely defies the simple narrative. It's the 6th smallest state by area, with just under 650,000 residents, and only 38.9% of those residents live in urban centers. Burlington, the largest city, has a population of 45,000. In most states, that would be a mid-sized town. In Vermont, it's the economic capital. But here's what makes Vermont genuinely interesting right now. It has been the most moved to state since 2020. So while we're talking about why people don't live there, there's a counter trend worth understanding. Remote work changed the calculus for Vermont significantly. People who no longer needed to commute to Boston or New York discovered that Vermont's quality of life, safety, and natural beauty were accessible to them in a way they hadn't been before. That said, the structural challenges challenges remain. Vermont's job market relies heavily on agriculture, small business, and seasonal tourism. The dairy industry, which produces 63% of New England's milk, has been facing declining profitability and persistent labor shortages. Ski season and fall foliage tourism drive significant seasonal revenue, but don't sustain year-round employment for a growing workforce. The cost picture is complicated. Vermont's median home price sits around $370,000, and the state's strict zoning laws and limited housing stock have made it difficult for new residents to find affordable options. The average household income runs about $65,000. That gap between income and housing cost is meaningful. Vermont consistently ranks among the safest states in America. Education quality is high, healthcare is strong, but the younger workforce tends to migrate toward Burlington, and even Burlington, at 45,000 people, can feel limiting for ambitious young professionals who want access to large markets and diverse career paths. The infrastructure in Vermont is strong relative to other states on this list. Roads are maintained, public services function well, but Vermont's geographic reality, steep terrain, isolated rural communities, brutal winters, creates logistical and economic constraints that are hard to overcome at the population level it currently operates at. The interesting question for Vermont is whether the remote work trend proves durable enough to meaningfully reverse its population trajectory. The state is betting on it, but betting on remote work as a sustainable migration driver assumes that the structural economic pressures pushing people toward larger metros don't reassert themselves, and historically they do. Number 5, North Dakota. You want to understand what it feels like to drive through a state that simply has no reason to stop moving through? Drive through North Dakota. 780,000 residents. An economy built on agriculture and oil. Winters that are, by any objective measure, among the harshest in the lower 48. Temperatures that plunge to negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit, with blizzards powerful enough to shut down commerce for days, and summers that deliver hot, humid conditions and severe flash flooding. Here's the data point that really crystallizes North Dakota's economic challenge. The state's largest city is Fargo, and Fargo has fewer than 130,000 residents. For comparison, that's smaller than a mid-sized suburb in the Sunbelt, and when your largest economic hub is that scale, the downstream effects on everything from consumer markets to healthcare infrastructure to professional services are significant. North Dakota's isolation from major urban centers is not just inconvenient, it's structurally limiting. The cost of supplying goods and services to a dispersed rural population is high. The tax base required to maintain roads, schools, and hospitals across that geography strains public finances. And the oil economy, while lucrative during boom cycles, is notoriously volatile. When oil prices fall, North Dakota feels it immediately and deeply. The real estate picture is one of the more affordable on this list. Median home prices around $260,000, and for good reason. Affordability alone does not attract population. The state has fewer than 1,000 restaurants statewide. Compare that to New York City, which has over 25,000. That's not just a lifestyle comparison. It's an economic indicator of the breadth of commercial activity and employment opportunity available in a given market. The Aspen Parkland ecosystem on the Canadian side of the border actually pulls potential agricultural settlers north rather than south. The city of Winnipeg, 70 miles north of North Dakota's border, has a population greater than the entire state. That comparative reality tells you something important about how economic history and geographic calculation shape settlement patterns across this region. Number 4, South Dakota. South Dakota is essentially North Dakota with slightly better weather and Mount Rushmore. That's not an insult, it's an economic observation. At approximately 910 to 999,000 residents spread across 77,000 square miles, South Dakota's density picture looks almost identical to its northern neighbor, 11 people per square mile. For comparison, New Jersey puts over 1,200 people into the same space. That density gap is the gap between a state that can sustain deep economic infrastructure and one that perpetually struggles to do so. South Dakota's economy relies on agriculture, tourism, and mining. Mount Rushmore and Badlands National Park draw millions of visitors annually, generating real revenue, but tourism-dependent economies have a fundamental instability problem. They're highly sensitive to broader economic conditions, fuel prices, and geopolitical events that affect travel behavior. The median household income runs approximately $63,000, below the national average, while housing costs have crept up to around $280,000. The state's rural infrastructure gaps, limited high-speed internet access, thin healthcare coverage outside population centers, sparse retail and commercial services, create a persistent quality of life ceiling that pushes ambitious younger workers toward larger markets. South Dakota's surface area is 177% larger than Florida's, yet it has fewer residents than the city of Jacksonville, Florida alone. That comparison is more than a geographic curiosity. It's a measure of how dramatically economic opportunity concentrates population over time. Florida's warmth, economic diversity, coastline, and infrastructure have built a 22 million person state. South Dakota Dakota's resource economy and harsh winters have kept a talented, hard-working population at under 1 million. Number 3, Alaska. Alaska is operating in a completely different category than every other state we've discussed today. This is not a state that's just sparsely populated. It is geographically isolated in a way that fundamentally reshapes every single economic calculation. 740,000 people, 663,000 square miles, 1 person per square mile on average, and if you exclude Anchorage, the only real city in the state, that density falls to approximately 0.5 people per square mile. To reach the nearest non-Alaskan U.S. city by road requires a 40-hour drive of 2,200 miles through remote Canada. Towns within Alaska itself are hundreds of miles apart. Many of the largest communities are not accessible by car at all. The state has just 16,000 miles of road, 5,000 fewer than Connecticut, a state you could fit inside Alaska 120 times over. The economic consequences of this isolation are profound. Everything costs more. Goods must be shipped or flown in at enormous logistical expense. The median home price runs around $325,000, and energy costs are dramatically elevated because of the heating demands of winters that regularly hit negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, with some northern regions seeing temperatures as low as negative 60. Alaska's economy is heavily dependent on the oil industry. That reliance has created both wealth and structural fragility. The average household income sits around $75,000, higher than the national average, but that figure is consistently offset by the cost of living premium that comes with geographic isolation. The state compensates residents with an annual oil dividend, a direct payment from state oil revenues to every qualifying resident. But that payment has never been enough on its own to overcome the cost headwinds. Winters in Alaska bring not just extreme cold, but darkness. Some northern areas experience 24 hours of darkness during the winter months, with fewer than 4 hours of daylight. That's not just uncomfortable. Research consistently links extreme light deprivation to mental health impacts, including depression and disrupted sleep patterns, which have real, measurable effects on productivity and economic activity. Here's what's actually interesting about Alaska. From an economic analysis perspective, the state has, for decades, been trying to diversify beyond oil. Tourism is growing. Technology infrastructure has been slowly improving. But the geographic reality creates a cost barrier to economic development that is simply not present in the contiguous states. You cannot build a major logistics hub and manufacturing cluster or a technology corridor in a place where basic transportation infrastructure requires a small fortune to maintain. And yet, Alaskans claim their state is the best to live in at higher rates than residents of virtually any other state. And that tells you something real about the quality of the natural environment, the sense of freedom, and the community that forms under extreme conditions. Alaska isn't declining, it's just operating under physical constraints that will always limit broad-based population growth. Number 2, and before we get to number 1, I want to step back and look at the bigger economic picture, because the pattern across all 9 of these states tells a story that goes far beyond weather and scenery. You might be wondering, what is actually driving population away from these states in the long run? Is it really just the cold? Here's what the data actually shows. Population follows economic opportunity with near mechanical reliability. The richest states by GDP, California at $4.1 trillion, Texas at $2.7 trillion, New York at $2.3 trillion, are also the most densely populated. That's not a coincidence. Economic density creates employment diversity, which creates wage competition, which creates the tax base that funds the infrastructure that makes a place livable at scale. The states we've been discussing today share a common set of economic characteristics: single sector or dual sector economies, oil, agriculture, mining, tourism, limited urban anchors, inadequate infrastructure to support broad-based commercial development, and housing cost dynamics that are increasingly disconnected from local wage realities. There's a migration pattern playing out in slow motion across America right now that most people aren't tracking carefully enough. Florida gained over 450,000 people between 2023 and 2025. Texas is on track to become the most populous state in America by 2050. The Sun Belt, Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Texas, is absorbing the population that the cold, rural, resource-dependent states are losing. And the economic gap between those two groups of states is widening, not narrowing. The irony is that some of the empty states have extraordinary land values, extraordinary natural resources, and extraordinary scenery. But land without economic infrastructure around it is just land. And in a 21st century economy where knowledge work, healthcare, logistics, and technology drive GDP growth, the ability to attract and retain educated mobile workers depends on quality of life factors, schools, healthcare, housing affordability relative to wages, connectivity, that many of these states struggle to deliver outside their small urban cores. Number 1, Wyoming. Wyoming is, by official measure, the least populous state in America, 580,000 people. But honestly, calling Wyoming number 1 on this list is almost misleading, because the truth is, Wyoming isn't unique. It's the clearest, most concentrated expression of everything we've been talking about. Here's the most important economic fact about Wyoming. 25% of the state's workforce is employed by state or federal government. 1 in 4 workers. In a functioning, diverse private economy, government employment typically runs closer to 15 to 17%. Wyoming's dependence on government employment is a direct consequence of the private sector's inability to generate sufficient diversified employment at scale in that environment. The natural resources Wyoming extracts, coal, oil, natural gas, generate real revenue, but they generate it in an industry that has been in structural decline, subject to global commodity price cycles, and increasingly vulnerable to long-term energy transition pressures. Coal consumption has been declining for years as natural gas and renewables take market share. Wyoming's economic future is, to a degree, no one in state government really wants to say out loud, genuinely uncertain. The real estate picture is telling. Wyoming's median household income at around $64,000 puts its residents in a structural position where financing the average home becomes difficult at current interest rates and price levels. And unlike states where low income is offset by dramatically low cost of living, Wyoming's geographic isolation creates cost premiums on goods and services that partially offset any affordability gains. The state is beautiful. Yellowstone, the Grand Tetons, world-class outdoor recreation, incredibly safe communities, excellent schools by most statistical measures. If you're looking for a quality of life that is genuinely difficult to replicate, and you're in a financial position to support yourself through remote work, retirement income, or the resource economy, Wyoming delivers. But 580,000 people is not a self-sustaining economic mass for a 97,000 square mile state without a major urban anchor, without economic diversification beyond resource extraction, and without the infrastructure investment required to attract and retain knowledge workers. Wyoming will remain what it has always been, one of the most beautiful places in America and one of the least populated. So here's the payoff for everything we've covered today. These states aren't empty because no one wants to live there. Some of the most visually stunning land in the world exists across these 9 states. They're empty because the economic equation doesn't work for the majority of the American workforce. Low wages relative to cost of living, limited employment diversity, inadequate infrastructure, and housing markets distorted by outside demand have created a structural barrier to population growth that weather alone can't fully explain. The states that are growing, Florida, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, Idaho, share a different set of economic characteristics. Sun and warmth help, sure, but what actually drives migration is jobs, affordable housing relative to wages, and a quality of life that the broad middle class can access without a 6-figure income. The empty states have a real choice ahead of them. They can compete by leveraging their land, their natural resources, and their quality of life to attract remote workers and retirees. Some of them, like Vermont and Maine, are beginning to do exactly that with real result. Or they can continue to rely on resource economies and government employment and slowly watch their populations age and decline. The real estate data, the income data, and the migration data all point in the same direction. In America, people vote with their feet, and right now, they're walking away from isolation and toward economic density, even when the scenery they're leaving behind is genuinely extraordinary. If you found this breakdown valuable, do us a favor and hit subscribe, because next time we're going to follow the money in the opposite direction and look at exactly where America's population boom is happening, what's driving it, and what it means for real estate, wages, and the economic map of this country over the next 20 years.